Thank you for being here, Branko. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to chat with you for Arena Pública. And I would like to start our conversation with one of the main characters of your new book, to call it some way, Vilfredo Peretto. So one of his works is on the circulation of elites. Like, he has a theory about how elites change and how institutions are constructed. So I was wondering, how do you see the relevance of that theoretical approach for our current days?
Well, it's a good question, actually, to start with Peretto. Not too many people start with Peretto these days. First, I actually use Peretto quite a lot, as we all do, as in adjusting for top incomes, because he was, of course, the first one to focus on top incomes, and then he was the first one to have defined the power law, which, of course, is used quite a lot. But he also had, as you alluded to, a sociological theory that essentially held that the elites are of different kinds, but every society is composed of an elite and the rest of the population. And he found what he thought was invariability of the distribution to essentially means that whatever elite you replace, that elite can be differently formed, but it would have more or less the same share of total income. So I find him quite interesting, and I think actually I would expect his popularity to come back, because the emphasis on the elites is not very different from the emphasis on top 1%. And I do think that actually he essentially by not replacing class, which I believe is still very important, by adding also the elite component, is somebody who talks very much to us now. Almost, well, actually, I think this year would be 100 years since his death, actually.
Yeah. So in that sense, I will guess that elites behave and are different depending on the distributive context in which they are embedded. And as you know, Latin America is a country, it's a region that has been persistently high, with high inequality in the income distribution, wealth distribution, and basically all type of assets that you look at. So how do you see that relationship between the workings of the elite and how they shape institutions, how distributive outcomes occur in the very long run? Because I know that you have done work on, for example, the Mexican case before colonial times, during the colonial times, and now in the present. And I know that you know the work by Guido Alfani. And one common thread that one can find is that Mexico is always, and seems like forever, a very unequal country.
I think Mexico, according to what we know, or at least what we think we know, if you look at, you mentioned the new work by Alfani and Cotter, they find extremely high inequality in pre-conquest times with the Aztec Empire, with, of course, very hierarchical structure, and the very top of the income distribution, which were basically the rulers, are extremely rich compared to everybody else. Then the study from Nueva España, which was from the 17th century, finds, interestingly, very similar Gini coefficient. And then we find, of course, in the 1920s and later, very similar high inequality. So it's a good question if we take these studies at face value, because I have to say there is always a little bit of a doubt about the past. We may be projecting what we think the past was into the data that we take. But if you take it at face value, then we can say, yes, this part of the world had always had very high inequality, but maybe the structural things that were behind that inequality were different. And I think, obviously, they were different. The Aztec society was very hierarchical, very defined by different formal classes, more or less. We talked about the warrior class and so on. The society of the 17th century was yet different, with a different elite, in this case actually foreign elite that came, which is also interesting when you look at these ancient societies. There are societies where really the elite was foreigners. So the asset was citizenship to some extent. They may not have, the other assets came from that. And then more recently, it was sort of a agrarian and a capitalist society. But what's interesting is that inequality has remained even under the very capitalistic and advanced society. Although we have to mention that also, that there was a decline of inequality in the last 10 to 15 years.
I know that you are very critical of the concept of human capital. And I would like to hear your opinions of using that type of concept as an anchor for how we understand deprivation. So as you know, Mexico has a multidimensional indicator of poverty, which is anchored on that notion of capabilities and human capital acquisition.
I'm simply not in terminological agreement with human capital, because I think that we can say the same thing simply by saying skilled labor. It is true that, of course, that labor to some extent is similar to what you do to capital, in the sense that you have to kind of create that labor in the same way that capital is created from human labor that is embedded in here. This is similarity. But leaving aside the technological stuff, yes, indeed, actually the skilled labor and greater educational attainment and greater skilling of labor, as we know, is associated with greater productivity and greater incomes. Recently read, for example, there was a nice article about Africa, which mentioned that Africa needs to increase its productivity. But in reality, what struck me there is no increase in productivity is not something that you decree, let it be higher. It is the result, of course, of capital investments and of human investments through skilling. And I think to the extent that human labor has become really increasingly important, even as an inventor, in the sense, for example, artificial intelligence is created by humans, after all. It is now a capital, but it's created by humans. I think that's a hugely important component. Of course, as you know, Oded Galler sort of talked about the era of capital and then the era of human capital. I'm not sure that it's exactly so sharp, but there is some truth to that.
Okay, so that brings me to one of your books, Global Inequality, where basically you are asked, well, now what in terms of policy? And one of the arguments that you make is that we need basically to redistribute access to assets, understood as wealth, but also as education. And how politically feasible that looks, not only in advanced societies, but also in developing countries?
For the redistribution of assets, human assets, I think technically it is doable, it has been done, and it's not really something particularly new, although politically may be difficult. In other words, what it means is essentially means free schooling, access to free schooling, obviously equal to everybody, and that free schooling then continue through the whole career. And then on top of that, a special, investments in public education, even at a very high level. Because I think the problem is the following. If at a very high level, university and postgraduate and graduate studies, if the perception is that private universities are better, then of course people will go there because they would earn much more later. But if the perception is changed, and after all, if you have enough money, you will change, because all the best professors will go to wherever they're paid the most. I think it is doable. I'm not saying it's cheap nor politically easy, but it's doable. Now, the second part, real financial capital and capital, productive capital, it's more difficult because it would imply redistribution either through payments of part of the salary in terms of shares in the companies. And it's true that some people actually argue, and some workers don't like that because they don't want to be linked to both to have labor income and capital income in the same company. And it politically becomes more difficult because people who have these assets now would lose a little bit of some control, not much, but they would lose a little bit of control over the management of these assets. So it is a more difficult proposition, and it has been tried. As you know, there are cooperatives like Mondragon in Spain. There are also ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans in the US. There are things in the UK, but it has not really been very successful. And for example, I read Isabel Sowell, for American economy, working on poverty. She argued that one way to push companies would be to give them special tax incentives to distribute shares to workers. And it could possibly then help. That proposal doesn't change capitalism as such. Capitalism still remains and actually becomes simply more widespread. Interestingly, people may not remember, but Margaret Thatcher proposed that. It never got very far, but that was her idea of people's capitalism. And partly she did it, for example, with, but that was different, she privatized housing. But she had this idea of people's capitalism and distribution of shares, but obviously it never went anywhere. So why would agree? That's a good question, because of course the dilution of their power would happen with that. And they would still have dominant power, but it would be a little bit less of power than they have now. So it is difficult, but I think through a combination of favorable taxation. So again, there, I don't think it is technically undoable. The question is there a political party, is there a political group who is going to push that agenda? Because it's an interesting agenda. It is pro-capitalist agenda, but it's of a capitalism that it would be less unequal. The point why I originally sort of pushed for that is if you have high concentration of capital, and if capital share in national accounts is increasing, then by definition you have an increased inequality, because people who are top by definition get more than people who are on the bottom.
Mexico is one of the countries where the capital share of total GDP is one of the largest, not only in the region. So that brings me to how do we understand the dynamic of persistent high inequality, taking, for example, as a framework, the idea of Kuznets waves.
But let me say something about the Kuznets waves. The idea, as you know, comes from Global Inequality book. And it's simply the extension of Kuznets in the following sense. What Kuznets saw and ascribed that process of increasing inequality to urbanization, higher wages in the urban sector, and greater dispersal of wage incomes in there. Underneath that process was a process of technological change whereby manufacturing became a dominant sector. The same logic could apply to any period of technological change. In other words, you create a certain set of jobs that are paying more than the other jobs, and they actually have a greater variability on what they pay. Kuznets didn't define that because at that time, really in 55, 60, he saw the technological revolution, but he was not able to project that it will be the third or fourth and fifth. My idea was simply to apply the Kuznetsian framework to today's IT revolution. And then I have to say that actually if you look at what has happened in several important countries recently, I think China fits that framework quite well. Brazil does it fit also. UK with a recent decline in inequality, and also most European countries where inequality went up in the 1990s and near early 2000 and is now sort of not increasing anymore. Because political forces that also Kuznets spoke of, in the second phase would actually prevent a further increase. So to summarize, technological change would be the driver of the upward swing, and then political forces, a redistribution of rents from innovation would be the forces that would actually stop the increase. So that was the idea behind it. Now, that story, which is a cyclical story, does not answer your question, which is a persistent inequality, because persistent inequality means that essentially you keep on staying on that level. So I would not then tend to generalize Kuznets waves. I would say that for the countries that we talked about Mexico before, there may be some forces I hate to say it endogenous, but some forces that despite a change in the structure push a given elite to the top, and that elite remains more or less equally extractive under different conditions. There is no single force that would keep this high inequality up.
You seem to agree with Acemoglu and Robinson in the sense that the persistence that we observe in Latin America in general is basically the persistence of institutions, that you see rotation in who is the particular elite, but the arrangement still extracts the same.
There are also some doubts that was Jeffrey Williamson and Leandro Prados, who actually argue that Latin American inequality is a relatively recent phenomenon going back to the 1820s, the independence of the countries, and then the inclusion in the world, division of labor, where these countries were essentially dependent on export of agricultural products. And then they argue that inequality might not have been as high before. So I think one has to, I don't know if this is exactly true or not, but one has to take this into account. In that case, inequality in Latin America would be structural, but structural in the way that the structurally thought of the inclusion within a system, global system of production. So that would be, I think, a little bit different. If I can kind of now summarize, the Acemoglu-Robinson would be the view that there are institutions within country that are extractive regardless of who is the elite. The other explanation would be that the elite adjusts to the type of the global system that requires that country to be part of. So the domestic inequality is to some extent determined by the external forces. So I think that two things are, maybe we can put them as two possible hypotheses of explanation.
And do you see, for example, in the current trends for deglobalization to some way and regionalization, an opening of a space that was open in the 46 with Bretton Woods, that nations can start to take a higher role in adjusting not only the rules of how we distribute and how we create a welfare state, but also how we insert into the global economy.
On structuralists, if I can go back to them for a second, for me, their importance was really extremely high. As I mentioned in my book, I acknowledge that they should have a higher place in the book than they do, and the reason why they don't is actually that my knowledge is not sufficiently good on them. But I thought of people like Furtado, Samir Amin, Prebisch. Why I think that they're important is the following reason. For the first time, actually, when you study inequality, for the first time, the international element determines the type of inequality that you would have domestically. And that type of inequality is such that enables that country to participate in this division of labor under specific conditions. So nobody else did that before them. Now, that international aspect, to go back to the direct question, with the Washington Consensus and reglobalization, spread it further because it really then affected not only income distribution, it affected directly policy. And whether we would be, with deglobalization, in some sense, weakening the chains, if I can call it like that, of policy making which existed within nation state, it's possible. I think we have certainly seen the decline of importance of the Washington Consensus. The fund can still use certain policies which are really not derivative of that because they go back to the fund from the 1960s or the 70s. But it seems to me that with deglobalization and possibly with the emergence of the Chinese alternative pole, I think there will be greater space for domestic policy making. So in that sense, you can actually see it as a favorable development.
I mean, the interaction of that with what we see inside the countries, with regards the rise of the far right, and in particular, a type of far right that caters to the masses, which is, I think, a phenomenon that we haven't seen since the first part of the 20th century. You do not necessarily have a let's say, combination of forces that ends up with societies that are more equal or that are more inclusive in a sense. So if we switch the lens from the international to the national, and let's say that they, as you said, the international chains are weakened, so what are the relevant cleavages that allow these types of movements to gain power and to attain a position of relevance in the policy decisions?
I think actually we should go back to basically 1990s, because there are several developments there. The end of communism, this sort of qualification or actually rejection of even obviously communist, but also socialist parties. The Communist Party of Italy, which was the largest communist party in the rich world, practically decomposed, disappeared. The French Communist Party disappeared, and the Socialist Party disappeared. I think what happened is the ideological change. Secondly, there was a significant change in the infrastructural production, in the sense that technological developments made mass labor much less frequent. We have now, this is interesting with the United Workers of America, it's a very interesting strike because it's really old-fashioned strike. But many workers work, not only gig economy, but work actually in jobs that are much more difficult to trade unionize. So syndicalist movement is weaker. And very often they work now with, especially now with working at home, they are not together. So I think that there are all these elements, plus the young people who don't find themselves any longer with the traditional parties, had led to the decline of socialist parties, certainly in Europe, in Eastern Europe where they don't exist at all, and then has led to the alternative parties. So I would actually see this increase of the right-wing parties as the result, on one hand, of neoliberal policies that left lots of population out, and the absence of an ideological alternative, because ideological alternative, either for the reasons of the failure of communist experiment, or for the reasons that the change of the type of the domestic organization of labor lost importance. So these people, to some extent, went to whatever remained as the alternative, and that alternative was so-called populist party. But look, even, just last point, look even at the names of the parties. We don't have any more names that indicate a party program. We have names like in Italy, like 5 stars. We have Macron, which has changed 3 times the name. It's Marchon, so walking forward. Anybody can be walking forward. We really don't have even the names that indicate what is the political orientation of the party. It has disappeared. And I think it's also very relevant to think, because that's how True Finns, for example, that was the right-wing party, or Golden Dawn in Greece. I mean, the names are, if you look at, for example, at fascist parties, at least they had, in that sense, they had a National Socialist Party. It's clear, national and socialist. But Golden Dawn, it can be any party. It could be left, right, center, up and down. It's very interesting, and that might appeal to people who have become, to some extent, depoliticized.
To speak of a common interest that we have, which is equality of opportunity. Like, equality of opportunity can be seen as a political agenda in the sense that it has a very clearly stated end goal. Something that we commonly hear is, I don't care about inequality of income, we should care about inequality of opportunity. When we actually know that they are closely related and you cannot separate them or consider them antagonists. So what role do you see in this conversation about inequalities for a discussion on inequality of opportunity?
I actually think that the major change here happened with work, including Miles Korak's work, which empirically showed that inequality of opportunity, defined in a very sort of narrow sense, what type of exogenous advantages enable you to get to a high income, is correlated with the outcomes of high inequality. In the past, as you were saying, one of the right-wing explanations of high inequality was, okay, who cares? Because if we have the American dream. If everybody has the same chance, today you will be rich, but tomorrow I will be rich. That's the famous story, a metaphor of Schumpeter's hotel. So we have some people who are on the first floor today, but then they would go to the fifth, and then fifth would come to the first. We know now that people who are on the fifth floor tend to stay there on the fifth floor. People who are on the front, on the bottom, they stay on the bottom. So empirically, I think we have seen the two things are correlated. And I think it's important, sort of essentially denial of that story that we don't need to worry about inequality because we should have the same, technically we have the same chances, and maybe there will be mobility. And moreover, we have, of course, as you know, and you have contributed to that, interpersonal studies of inequality. So then you see intergenerational, studies of inequality. So you see that actually these advantages are being transferred over generations. So I'm in that sense optimistic. I think that the left-wing story about correlation between intergenerational inequality or a low social mobility and high inequality of outcomes is pretty strong. So I think that we are in a much stronger grounds than essentially an ideology that was not based on data, but they claimed that outcomes are really don't matter because opportunities are the same. And the opportunities were never the same.